Hi, this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and today I'm going to be presenting a game, Game 5 of the tiebreakers of the 2011 Candidates Semifinals match between Vladimir Kramnik and Alexander Grischuk, both of Russia. And so what's going on in this match? Well, they had drawn the first 4 games in regulation time. Then they drew the first 4 games of the first tiebreaker, which was 25 minutes, time control for each, 10-second increment. And now they're down to the first rapid tiebreaker, which is 5 minutes each with a 3-second increment. And so both players have been drawing like crazy. They drew 8 straight games before this game. And so Kramnik here, I think, in this game he tried to push a little too hard for the win. So he starts with knight f3. Kramnik has played knight f3 a good amount and c4 in his career. And Grischuk trying to take things more or less into something of a Sicilian now. And so after e4, Kramnik is playing the Maroczy bind, a Maroczy bind structure, which would seem to favor his style in that you typically risk little in this formation as white controls the d5 square, and you can, GMs try to win games with this structure as white because you can really squeeze your opponent and try to grind his position, and that's really Kramnik's style. So out of the opening, I figured this was good for Kramnik, and especially in a blitz game, it's very easy to play the structure as white. And so after bishop e2, bishop g7, this is pretty standard stuff as far as black has gone into a dragon setup where the bishop is going to exert some pressure on the center. His knights are obviously exerting pressure on the center, and white is mainly playing to maintain his pawns on e4 and c4, prevent black from playing any kind of d5 or b5 freeing thematic breaks. So bishop e3, and there's a sideline here involving knight g4 in an attempt to trade off pieces. It just leads to equality essentially, nothing more. Possibly bishop takes g4. There's a couple complications there. Anyway. So to proceed, just worth mentioning, it's a pretty frequent tactic in these positions for black. So going forward, now bishop d7 and queen d2. So what's going on in the game? Well, white has a very powerful center, and he's definitely restricting black's movements here. But black has a very solid position. He's got no weaknesses, and his pawns are very fluidly protecting each other, you could say. So he has absolutely no weaknesses in the position. So now he plays knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and bishop c6. So he simply wants to trade that knight off as his position is a little bit more cramped. White has a little more space. So, trading a couple of pieces is going to help him out, especially as he managed to develop this bishop to a good diagonal, a good square. So now bishop d3, and this was an interesting move. Typically, I think white plays f3 in these positions, and also queen e3 is worth considering. So bishop d3 I thought was a little strange from Kramnik. He was playing almost immediately at this point, I guess trying to get a time advantage against Grischuk in the opening. So now a5, very standard move by black. He wants to inhibit white from gaining even more space by playing b4, and thus will be threatening b5. So a5 is a good move. Definitely inhibits that plan by white as far as gaining more space. So now rook e1. I thought when he played bishop to d3 that he was going to be planning transferring the other rook to e1 and pushing the f pawn and really trying to blow up the center and go after Grischuk. Instead, rook e1, and Kramnik stays true to his style. It's very slow developing, just kind of grind your opponent. So now knight d5, all his pieces pointing towards the center. Worth mentioning here, knight takes d5, not such a great move because it allows bishop takes g7, and now the king's going to have to take. And white would most likely choose to open up the e-file. He gains a little more space with that pawn on d5, and essentially just going to have some enduring pressure on the e-file and maybe get the queen to c3 to seize that diagonal against black's king. So that's why black didn't want to go into that. So instead, he just plays knight d7, didn't want to allow any doubling of his pawns on f6, and trades off white's dominant bishop on d4 for his bishop on g7. So now as the pieces are getting traded, it just makes black's defense of the position easier. Not to mention, he has a pretty good bishop on c6, against white has a pretty bad bishop on d3 as his pawns are on light squares, restricting its mobility. So rook e3, and now I think Kramnik went for a little bit too much. He wanted to win this game, I'm sure, as he's got white, and it's going to be tough to beat Grischuk with the black pieces. So rook e3, and he's just, I think he kind of tried to force it here. He was tired of all draws. So with rook h3, the attack seems a little bit superficial as he doesn't have his other rook included in it. Maybe bringing the other rook to f1 was a good try, but he played knight to e3, and this was almost immediately here. He's threatening knight f5 with an ensuing mate. So if black wasn't careful, he could run into some trouble after possibly knight f5 check and some complications ensuing here. Seems slightly unclear to me. I don't see much of an immediate win for white in this position, but it's possible that he does indeed have something along the lines of check, speculation. Maybe not enough for white in this position, but he does definitely. He's got some jokes here against black's king. He's definitely not very comfortable with the black king. So instead, Grischuk, he played rook h8 to defend against those threats, and now if knight f5 and there's no queen possibility of coming to h6, the king's gonna go to f8 easily. So after rook h8, rook to g3, and now I just felt like this knight is misplaced on e3. He's just trying too hard, because after rook h8, now knight to c5, and this check all of a sudden doesn't do anything because the rook is controlling the h6 square. So now the knight just kind of looks silly. The knight would definitely be better placed on c3, where it would be defending the e4 pawn. And now here, I don't know what happened by Kramnik. He had 3.5 minutes left. I think maybe you don't want to play this move, but queen c2, defending that pawn, and you don't want to play it because rook c8 is going to put some pressure along the c-file on the white queen, but this seems a lot more natural than what happened in the game. So in the game, he played rook to d1, and essentially sacrificing the pawn on e4. And so Grischuk first plays pawn to h4. So kind of, okay, where's the rook going to go? Is it going to go to g4, h3, or even f3? Well, f3 is probably not a very good square as the bishop's on that diagonal. So he goes to h3. G4 would probably be a little trap there. So now the rook is cut off on h3. The knight on e3 is not really doing very much, and black just wins a pawn. So now bishop to f1. By trading the bishops, I just don't see white really gaining that much. Maybe in this position, maybe he's going to win a pawn back. But even after a move, let's say, well, not so fast. Maybe just knight g5, picking off the exchange, the rook on h3, and that's going to be a pretty easy win. So maybe that's what Kramnik overlooked, was the intermediate move in this position, h4. And now after the knight comes to e4, it can come to g5 and attack the rook. So bishop takes, now bishop f1. And so now black is just won a pawn, although it doesn't seem like he's going to keep it. But in this position, queen takes, and a similar idea, as the rook on h3 has no squares. So now after this rook moves, doesn't really matter where, black is just going to win the exchange and almost certainly the game. So the d6 pawn is defended by that tactic. And now bishop takes, just trading the strong knight of white. And now look at the endgame. Black is up a pawn, and he's got a great knight on c5 against a bad bishop on f1. So the endgame is not fun to play for white, and he's down a pawn to boot. So black is just trying to shore up his position and play solidly, and so Kramnik was kind of forced to concede another positional flaw, I guess, trying to open up the position. And now a nice move by black here, rook b6, and simply Okay, the d6 pawn is defended nicely. Let's put some pressure on the b3 pawn as well as inhibit white playing b4 and kicking off black's great knight on c5. So h3 here, trying to make some loot for Kramnik. Both players had about 2 minutes here. I kind of would have liked to play maybe, rook to d8 here, although it seems like it doesn't quite work because maybe white can try to mix it up with a rook takes e5 idea and try to trade some pawns off, and maybe he can achieve a draw with trading pawns. So anyways, rook takes b3, rook takes, and now queen takes d6, and I'm sure Kramnik was pretty comfortable that he could win this position up a pawn and with a solid knight. So he starts with rook to rook c8. And now he's just going to play knight to c5, shore up his position with a move like rook c6. And this bishop is going to be bad on f1 the whole game because the pawn is on c4. So I think rook d5 here, possibly if white could have rerouted the bishop and gotten it to d5, maybe he can try to hold this position, but that's easier said than done. So rook to d5 is understandable. He wants to try to fight for that c5 square if possible and just play defense actively and put pressure on black's position, make black earn the win. Well, the knight's gotten to c5. It's going to be defending that b7 pawn nicely, and white has to open up the position to activate his bishop along a good diagonal. Rook c6. And now it's just an easy win for black. He's got a pass pawn in the center, protected pass pawn to boot. Extremely solid position with his knight and his pawn on c5 and b6. And now he's going to activate the rook. So now, trade a few pawns, open up a front along the king side, and with rook h6. And now Kramnik was getting low on time. He had about 45 seconds. Grischuk a minute and a half. And nice little tactic. Knight e6 as rook takes b6 would be a horrible blunder, dropping the rook to the check. So knight e6, a nice rerouting maneuver to get the knight to d4, a more active square. And in this position, now the knight is just dominating too much, and black is going to simply march that pawn down. The rook is defending the b6 pawn, as well as threatening to invade along the h-file. So really, really difficult for white. And here you can see how bad the bishop really is on d1. So now Kramnik I think he just played a complete blunder in this position with rook b5. And after knight takes b5, he resigned. But, withstanding that blunder, white is completely lost in this position. I mean, the bishop is dominated, and after a move like rook b4, an important point: black does not want to play a move. He does not want to liquidate these queenside pawns, because in some positions, white will be able to sacrifice this bishop for a pawn and force a draw. So a very finely played game by Grischuk. I'm sure Kramnik didn't want to decide this in a tiebreaker, a rapid blitz game for who goes on to play the world champion. But this game followed 8 consecutive draws between these two guys, so you can't complain if it goes down to a blitz game after 8 drawn games. So a great game by Grischuk. Definitely be interesting to see him play the finals with Boris Gelfand. So this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and thanks for tuning in.